Good evening from Germany, Freising, from also another very hot place in Europe right now. I'm super excited to talk about micro frontends, or the reusage and sharing of functionalities and design between micro frontends. So, first of all, who am I? Who is currently talking to you? I'm Vanessa. It's very, very nice to meet you all. I'm a front-end developer at a small startup called Savvy. I was working in an agency before, so if you're wondering why I'm working at a startup and talk about micro frontends, I actually don't do this as a startup. This is not our use case. But before that, I was working on a pretty huge customer project on a 10 to 15-year-old code base, which included not only things like different websites, different mobile apps, different backend services, but they also had like different names. So they had several child companies, and our microfront and microservice setup should be like, white label is the wrong word, but should be like the one solution for this whole technical architecture. You can hear me or listen to me in various podcasts. I'm the host of the podcast Expect Exception. It's about front-end testing, a German web development podcast, A Working Draft. And from time to time, we also record some episodes about drinking wine and whiskey called Ausbaufähig. Previously, I was in the program committee from the JS Congress and a chapter lead for the DACH region for the Frontend Foxes. Just because I'm a full-time employee and I have 3 podcasts, I decided to step down there, and unfortunately had to leave the JS Congress and Frontend Foxes recently this year. So when talking about micro front ends, I don't have the time right now because I only have like this 20 minutes. I won't have the time to get you completely into what is a micro front ends, what should it do, how does it look like from a technical perspective, how to use Webpack modulation, or how to generally build them up. But what I want to talk about is how to share and what to share between the micro front ends and why it often don't work. This talk is a bit difficult for me because it's not really about which technologies to use to share functionalities. I think most of us are very familiar with the concept of having private NPM packages, or also just to share files via GitHub, to run scripts for documents that are just in various repositories that your pipelines have access to. A problem when it comes to sharing is often that people try to share the wrong things. And then it gets also very complicated to find out how to share them. So this is a very good indicator. If you're sitting there trying to share functionality for a micro front end and you see that you can't find a good technical way to do this, it often is the point that you might not should share these piece of functionality between micro front ends, or unless you just open another mono repository in different repositories. So the goal of micro front ends is to separate your concerns. If your sharing goes to a point that it's not shared anymore, maybe micro front ends themselves are not the right thing to do here. All right, but let's first talk about what you can share and how you can do this. So in this slide, we see 4 micro front ends. They can be on different pages of your website. They can be completely on different websites, or we can also assume that these 4 micro front ends are bundled together. They are not bundled together, but they are visible together and appear together on the same website page the user is just looking to. So how to make sure they look alike? This is a very common question, especially from project managers, asking designers and developers, if we break them up in different teams, in different micro front ends, won't this be chaotic from the design perspective? Will this one have a black font, this one a gray font size 14 pixel, font size 16 pixel? So, and this is not really different from all of the other codes. So this is not really a problem of micro frontends, but of huge web applications in general. What you have to do to share the same design between all of the micro frontends is simple as use a design system. A design system, you can see it as a component library, more connected to the design. You can also build the design system coming from tools like Figma, and also allowed in tools like Figma is, for example, build something like your design tokens. Design tokens, think of any kind of hex color that you have in mind, hex code, or you think of the HTML color cornflower blue or hot pink. And design tokens are there to be the same variable for different platforms. So you can also have the same colors for iOS apps, Android apps, or for your various platforms, or for your various micro frontends. So a component library. A difference that can be is depending on your structure. On your teams, do you have one team caring about the component library, or is this a work from all teams combined? And every time a team having several micro frontends need a new component and add it to the component library. Then, depending on this kind of structure, you will find problems how to update the others. So if you use a component library, make sure just to use schematic versioning, write down the changes, write down if they are breaking changes, and think of it as an open source software, like you're using any kind of other library that you consume. For example, you can share this using private NPM packages, and just assuming that you won't share components using a component library, and all of your micro frontends re-implement the same components, there you might actually will run into a performance problem because you have to load so much HTML and CSS. What you also need, for example, is a layout service, and the layout service for the surrounding structure of the page. Like you have your micro frontend here and here and here, but you somehow have to say, okay, this is a header area, this is a content area, and this is a footer area. So wrapping of all micro frontends is a dump service that doesn't know much about logic, but it just rearrange your micro frontends on the page, a layout service. The second question is how to share functionalities between those micro frontends. And there, if you Google for it, it gets complicated. One thing I also saw said in the past, and that I also saw online, is share nothing. The share nothing principle. Because you wanted to have micro frontends to separate your concerns. So a problem is that developers try to keep it dry because we were raised to keep things dry. I wouldn't share simple primitive functions, the same as I don't have a loadish function for each filter or array method I try to achieve, because then I always add external resources with a risk, with a maintaining risk. But there are indeed things you need to share. We already talked about the share nothing won't work because you should share your designed components. You should also share these kind of layout service, which arranges your page. But additionally to that, there are some things that should have one single source of truth and not be re-implemented. What can be re-implemented, as I said, if you have array manipulations, whatever, things that often change based on the feature. Don't share it, because then you really have to update all micro frontends, each micro frontend all of the time. And sometimes you are sitting there at this code, and let's say you want to have an array from item 0 to 10. And now for your feature, you need to have it from item 0 to 9. And if you have to be careful because other teams are also using this component, then it gets complicated. So try not to share this. But what you need to share is some kind of routing service. Let's assume you have server-side routing and the micro frontends are parts of one page. So the logic about different routes should not really be in the single micro front end. So make sure to have a routing service that knows about all of the routes, knows about A/B tests and whatever, and just handles the route for all of the services. Same for API gateways or just API addresses and URLs. You also want to have that a bit abstracted, assuming that the same micro frontends might use the same API. Can be a bit now really not dry if you repeat your URLs here and here and here and here and have to update all of them at once. Something that people are not sure of is if vendors should be shared. Vendors like your front-end framework, React, Vue, or any of the other frameworks. Also other vendors like an HTML sanitizer and whatever you might need. So a problem if you share vendors. How would you do that? You would go to this layout service, and this layout service that arrange your micro frontends on the page would also add like an assets and a vendor's JavaScript file. The problem with this approach is that the micro frontend itself would not work. It would not run. This is because if the micro frontend itself doesn't include the vendor JavaScript, and you are outside of this layout service, and you would add this micro frontend to completely other tech stack, it would fail without the vendors. So we need to be careful here. But in general, because it's basically just JavaScript and or HTML in a browser in this case, it is of course possible to put out a vendor into this layout services and to say, okay, the layout service knows that the 5 micro frontends are on this page, and these 5 micro frontends need these 10 libraries to work. And this layout service makes sure to load these 10 libraries. A problem when using micro frontends can be if the micro frontend come from another domain and are not shared between each other, that you might end up loading, for example, React.js twice on the page. This is also not a problem that should stop you. Compared to many other things that people are doing, from huge images that are not optimized, but also from way too huge bundles because you load your whole mono repository just on the landing page. Compared to that, a React.js library is actually pretty small, and you could say that the browser takes care of the caching, although there's also a risky thing to say. Another thing that you might want to share is an event bus, a JavaScript side event bus, to talk between micro frontends, if you need to do this. So the more that your micro frontends need to communicate, you again see, maybe our micro frontends are not structured in the right way, because why should they communicate if they're independent? But it can happen. It can happen that a micro frontend says, okay, I'm the product thingy, and the user want to take this product into the cart. I don't know anything about the cart, but I know someone wants to know that something happened with these items, and the other ones can listen to it and check with their backend APIs if they somehow have to update. And maybe you have a long polling policies for the updating of the micro frontends with their backends, and you might want to have the same policy for all of them, and have just a loose, separated document which describes how you're solving this problem. The other extreme is to share everything, and nope. If you need to share everything, then micro frontends are not the right architecture for the tech project. I think you can imagine just how this ends up, how you try to maintain this tree of shared everything everywhere. And it's basically not possible to at some point update a single thing of this because you don't know what else you will break for this. As I said, if you need to share all of these things, micro frontends are not correct. If micro frontends are correct and you see yourself sharing all of these things because you are used to do this, for example, you try to share interfaces for TypeScript. This is not business logic. This is specific for your project. If you want to use TypeScript, cool. If you need this interface, cool. But don't try to share one with other micro frontends because you don't know how their tech stack is really built up. So the answer is share what needs to be shared, for example, via global variables. If we're honest, everything is already shared because we're on the same browser. The only thing that micro frontends are really not connected are if every single one of those is an iframe, but this is not the case. They are already connected by having the same global variables. You can use a loose document, for example, for your polling policy to check also things like env, environment variables, or you can use a strict written library like your router.js or similar. So what I said before is that sharing is not the complicated part. Usually finding out what not to share makes sharing complicated, because then you run into the problem, I don't really know how to technically share this, is often the problem of you try to share something incorrectly. And this is not happening on small features. Oftentimes the problem comes before in the architecture of the whole micro front-end setup. When you start a project now using micro front-ends, it's often project managers and project owners asking designers, which usually design whole pages, and developers who usually work on a header, work on the product page, work on a footer, how to structure the micro frontends. And a problem is if you're not split your micro frontends by a domain, by a business logic, but in a way that you think about it as a developer to say, okay, I have a header component, a footer component, a navigation component, but the splits of micro frontends are based on business logic, not on visible components. So if it is a box, if it is something with a border around it, doesn't mean this is a good micro frontend. Look at the business logic. So in a micro frontends repository architecture, you can have here one repository, and this one repository has 4 fragments. Think of a fragment as one micro frontend. But sometimes you of course can have several micro frontends for one business logic domain and gather all of them in your one fragment or microservice, micro frontend service clustered by your business logic. As an example, you can hear your products business logic repository, including micro frontends for all products, like a category overview or a search page. You have your product details page, and then you have things like your daily deal. Could be also related to marketing, but it's a daily deal about the product. And you have things like recently viewed for the products. So, but now let's think of what problems a micro front-end architecture should actually solve. So you come on the landing page, you go to these product categories, you go to the product detail page, you go to the cart. Maybe you even have a chatbot flow, a conversational flow for the user to make it more engaging. You have the checkout and you have the account. But you also already on the product categories or on the product detail page, you have a navigation where you need the cart or information about the account. So you have your different fragment services for a product, a cart, and a checkout. And they should be appearing on the page, not based on the design, but coming from the right micro front-end services. For example, you have here a bad example for a page structure. You have a header, a footer, and a navigation from some kind of a weird layout micro front-end service. You have a product detail page and you have the cart. And you also have in the header a link to my orders in the navigation of the header, for example. But now think of this. In the header, there's usually also a basket displaying the items in the counter, the counter of items in the cart. And you have on the navigation, maybe your recently viewed products. And you have your recommendations based on what you bought last. And here's the problem. The cart would need to update the cart of the header. So Shouldn't the basket belong to the cart micro frontend service? And the recently viewed product, we just said, isn't this belonging to the product? And your recommendations are belonging to the order. And now you try to share things between those because they are kind of similar. For example, the cart microservice tries to share something with the basket of the header micro frontend. And this is because it's not split clearly by business logic, but via components. So a better, I'm sorry. So split micro frontends by the business logic, not by a technical architecture built on components. So a better way is here, we have our header, footer, and navigation aligned by our layout service. We have our product detail page, we have our my orders, and we have the cart. But the cart and the basket belongs together, the recently viewed products and the product detail page belongs together, and your recommendation belongs to your my orders micro frontend service. And with that, you don't need to share things between micro frontends because they are already in the same scope. Thank you for listening, and then let's head over to the Q&A. Bye-bye.